In trying to establish civil rights, in trying to build a schooling system that does not discriminate based on language and culture, it takes more than lawsuits, it takes more than building the knowledge base, it takes more than building capacity. This is an issue, English learner education, bilingual education, that always gets caught in larger political battles. And as we entered this next part, the late 20th century, we had a hefty start on building a field, but we entered an era of tremendous economic recession here in California. And economic recessions always involve searching for scapegoats. We entered an era of increasing immigration from South and Central America. There was refugee resettlement from the Southeast Asian wars. And as a result of that immigration and refugee resettlement, California was being remade. We were entering an era of fast demographic change. That demographic change, as everybody was watching it, was leading to changes in the cultural, linguistic, and racial composition of our state. As many whites were seeing the writing on the wall about them becoming a shrinking part of the state, entering an era where there would be no ethnic majority was leading to a rise in an English-only movement. And that English-only movement and anti-immigration movement would change everything. The pushback that was coming from teachers not wanting to get trained, the pushback that was coming from parents who were concerned about weak programs for their children, was now joined by a pushback from all of these other forces, and it became an era of outright backlash. Across the country in 1983, seemingly unrelated to all of this, A Nation at Risk was released. It was a report that basically said, our nation is at great risk because our children are not learning to read. And that anxiety, mixed with this anxiety, was the beginning of what would become what I think of as a perfect storm here in California. That's my perfect storm. It was pushback and backlash, and by 1984, we were beginning to have this pushback speak explicitly to bilingual education. A San Diego grand jury was formed, and this grand jury was focusing on bilingual education. Now, as all grand juries, you don't really know quite what's going on in them until they release their reports. But I want to read you a little bit from the grand jury. They attacked bilingual education and accused bilingual ed of serving the political interests of minorities while failing to address the needs of English learners by delaying their educational development. And in the report, the grand jury questioned both the cost effectiveness of bilingual programs and accused them of being un-American by supporting ethnic cultures and languages and encouraging children to hold on to their home language. The Chicano Federation's Education Committee, yes, that same Chicano Federation that was started by Pete Chacon back there in those activist days of the Chicano walkouts, put together a press conference. And the next day, the headline in the San Diego Union read, "Grand Jury Hits Bilingual Ed," and reads, "The report," an 11-page statement, concluded that bilingual education promotes a type of cultural apartheid in that it encourages a dual society. It goes on to charge that public funds are expended to promote and encourage ethnic institutions, which in turn delay the assimilation of young people into the American mainstream. This was the beginning of the arguments that would pervade our state and hit across the country as well. The New York Times picked up the story, and they said, "It came as a surprise to residents of San Diego when the county grand jury recommended that all local school districts eliminate bilingual education, arguing such programs are impractical, expensive, and un-American." But then they went on to report about the community pushback and about what the Chicano Federation was doing in response. And they quoted a spokesperson from the Chicano Federation as saying, "The issue here is simply not bilingual education. There is backlash, an attitude that minorities are getting too much for nothing, and that kind of racist, chauvinist thinking continues to see bilingual education as something unpatriotic." So there was community response, but that grand jury set the stage for much of what was to happen. In 1986, on the ballot in California, an English-only initiative. Proposition 63 passed by a 2-to-1 margin. And though courts declared it had symbolic value only, it didn't have any practical value, it was a flashpoint for an English-only sentiment in the state. It started in Monterey Park as a local initiative, grew to the statewide initiative, spread across the country as a strategy of the English-only movement, and that very year, 1986, California allowed its Chacon-Moscone Bilingual Bicultural Education Act to sunset, weakening programs tremendously. And then boom, 2 years later, 1994, a second major English-only initiative hit the ballot. This one, though, Proposition 187, called Save Our State, coupled those notions about English-only and anti-immigration with a direct hit on the undocumented. Proposition 187 sought to prohibit the undocumented from partaking in any public services, including schooling, but also including services for families, et cetera. And it, too, passed by a 2-to-1 margin, as had Proposition 63. And it, too, was struck down by the courts. But nonetheless, it really whipped up the anti-undocumented frenzy in the state. And then a third one, 1996, 2 years later, Proposition 209, called the Civil Rights Initiative. In fact, a pushback against many of the civil rights gains of the movement, and specifically affirmative action, seeking to end affirmative action based on race, color, and national origin. So we were in a full-fledged backlash, trying to undo all of the progress of that past period of time. And then, in 1997, Proposition 227, a direct hit on bilingual education. Called English for the Children, we called it the UNS Initiative, named after the billionaire who funded the whole thing. Whereas the English language is the national language of the United States of America and of the state of California, and is spoken by the vast majority of our residents, it's also the leading world language for science, technology, and international business, thereby being the language of economic opportunity. And whereas immigrant parents are eager to have their children acquire a good working knowledge of English, thereby allowing them to fully participate in the American dream, and whereas the government and the public schools of California have a moral obligation to provide all California's children with the skills necessary, among them literacy of English, that is the most important. And whereas the public schools of California currently do a poor job of educating immigrant children, wasting financial resources on costly experimental language programs whose failure over the past 2 decades is demonstrated by the current high dropout rate and low English literacy levels of immigrant children, and whereas young immigrant children can easily acquire full fluency in a new language such as English if they are just fully exposed to that language, therefore, be it resolved that all children in California schools shall be taught English as rapidly and effectively as possible. And when Prop 227 hit, all over the state, programs shut down. It had been an ugly, polarized political battle. The negative sound bites from that battle still resound throughout the state and still affect many people's attitudes about bilingual education. As programs closed, books were thrown away or put in sheds. And those movements to try to hold on to the notion that language is a human right, that a child's use of their home language in their education is really key, all of that went by the wayside. We were in a full-fledged backlash. In the ashes of the Prop 227 campaign, Californians Together was formed from the organizations that had been the No on 227 campaign. And when Californians Together came together, we said we have to have an ongoing policy and advocacy voice in the state that is going to hold the line against attacks on English learners and begin to build toward those powerful programs that we know are so possible. But still, you'd think that was enough, but oh no, the perfect storm was building to a Category 4 hurricane. You wouldn't think this was necessarily related, but it all adds up. In the year 2000, something called the National Reading Panel released their report. In response to that nation at risk back there, Congress had commissioned a National Reading Panel to look at all the research and to find out what we need to know about how to teach children reading. But because there was so much for them to work with, they decided they would not deal with the research on English learners. And when their report came out, they listed the 8 components of reading instruction that are needed, which is comprehensive. but they included two in particular, phonics and decoding, that had been at the heart of a reading war in this nation that was developing between whole language and phonics. This reading war would end up being devastating for our English learners because of the pedagogy that became infused into instruction and curriculum throughout the state, and because it came as part and parcel with No Child Left Behind. In 2001, the federal government, again responding to that notion of a federal role and seeing to it that children are getting equal educational opportunity, passed what seemed to be a real equity-focused piece of legislation. They were concerned about closing gaps, shining a laser-like beam on English learners and the gap between English learners and other students. And in some ways, it was such a welcome policy. It was based on the notion of standards. If we have a set of standards that everybody is going to be implementing, then kids will have equal education. If we test to be sure that they're learning, we'll be able to monitor the gaps and hold people to really closing those gaps. And then if we have a good accountability system that responds to the impacts of testing, that, in the notion of the feds and No Child Left Behind, would be a great equity-based policy. This became the policy of the land in 2001. The thing is, No Child Left Behind wrote into the policy something called Reading First, based on the pedagogy of the reading wars. $5 billion in professional development money going out to the field. And let me explain to you what happened as a result. Remember that really robust understanding of language way back then with Krashen and Cummins and others, that language involved the dual language brain and involved meaning making and comprehensible input? Under No Child Left Behind, language started to be narrowed, to be thought of as literacy. Now, for English learners, language is reading and writing and listening and speaking. It's not just reading and writing, right? They need to speak. Oral language is the foundation for literacy. It's the foundation for owning language. But language became reduced to literacy. Literacy became reduced to reading. So what got left out? Writing. The productive process of coming up with language, of using your voice. And reading became narrowed to just a few discrete skills of reading. Not that whole set of 8 things that were in the National Reading Panel, just a few discrete skills, and those discrete skills were specifically decoding and phonics. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this is what got left out. The dual language brain, language production, making meaning, all of those kinds of things. And remember, this was all part of federal policy with strong testing in California in English, because we were an English-only state at that point. And do you remember what happens when you test English learners in English? By definition, they're not proficient. That's what it means to be an English learner. But hearken the shadows, the legacy of those days of the IQ testing and the way in which it became sorting and tracking. Those schools with large numbers of English learners in them that were now testing, not proficient, and then getting, as a result of it, corrective action and program improvement under accountability, which insisted that they provide a curriculum that looked like mandated minutes in English language arts, mandated minutes in math. You had to have ELD, so that was good, but it was separate. And then all of those kids that weren't doing very well in English language arts, which was being delivered through one-size-fits-all pacing, through fidelity to these textbooks that were written for English proficient students. And in these mandated minutes, those students that weren't doing well, that weren't keeping up, all of those English learners, big time reading intervention. And reading intervention, can you guess, was based on this. So, did they get science? A few schools that held on to it, maybe, but most likely not. Did they get art? No. Did they get anything else? Most likely not. Because under corrective action, and what we think of, many people think of, as the hammer of accountability, all of this was nailed into place through that system. Very heavily monitored in such a narrow curriculum, so they have narrowed access, all of those things they weren't getting anymore. The reliance on interventions, and you know what happened? Can you guess? The English learner gap did not close. It persisted. So those were the No Child Left Behind years. And nowhere on the table was bilingualism. Nowhere on the table was the dual language brain. As a result of this testing and the tyranny of the testing, bilingual programs almost totally disappeared. Dual language programs almost totally disappeared. Less than 4% of the English learners in the state were getting any kind of home language in their schools. And that was the backlash era. Disappointing results, a persistent gap, the disappearance of all of that understanding about the richness of language and what language development needs to be about, and about the place of home language, all of it nailed into place through policy and an accountability system. How will we get our way out of this? That's the story for the next chapter.